Welcome to Question It, the podcast where we rethink health, wellness, and personal growth. I'm Kevin, your host, chief inquisitor, and sometimes guinea pig, exploring fresh paths to a better life. Let's dive into today's episode and get started. In today's episode, we're using Google's Notebook LM to summarize my recent episode that breaks down the difference between big T trauma and little t trauma, or tiny traumas. Unfortunately, it is these repeated tiny traumas that we're experiencing every day that is creating so much stress and emotional pain. Let's get right to it.
Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at something that might surprise you. The impact of what are called tiny traumas on our emotional well-being. We're going to be taking a look at an episode of the Question It podcast. And you might be surprised to learn that these seemingly insignificant experiences can actually have a much bigger impact than you might think. You know, those little digs, subtle put-downs, the times when you just feel overlooked. Well, those are the tiny traumas we're talking about today.
Yeah, what's fascinating is how these contrast with what we think of as like big P traumas, you know, those major life events, or adverse childhood experiences. Those are definitely significant. But these tiny traumas, these repeated negative experiences, they can actually build up over time and really shape our emotional landscape in some pretty profound ways.
Yeah, and it's almost sneaky how these tiny traumas work.
Yeah.
They often fly under the radar. The Question It podcast breaks them down into four main categories: shame, judgment, neglect, and rejection. And later on, the host throws in a bonus fifth category that really drives the point home: degradation.
It's almost like a checklist. You can run through and see if any of these resonate with your own experience. Let's start with shame. Think about those moments when someone criticizes your choices, makes you feel inadequate or unworthy. The podcast gives the example of a parent criticizing a child's food choices, saying something like, "Pancakes will make you fat." You can imagine how that kind of comment, especially repeated over time, could make a child feel ashamed of their choices and even their body.
Yeah, and shame can really linger, can't it?
Absolutely.
It can make us second guess ourselves, hesitate to take risks, even sabotage our own success.
Exactly. And while shame is focused on making the person feel bad about themselves, judgment is more about creating distance and shutting down connection. It's less about you're bad and more about you're different. And I don't approve of that difference. Imagine a parent who, instead of shaming their child for making pancakes, says something like, "I don't eat unhealthy foods like that." It's subtle, but it creates a divide, making the child feel like their choices aren't accepted or valued.
It's like they're being told, your way of being isn't welcome here. That can be really isolating, especially for a child who's looking to their parents for guidance and acceptance.
Absolutely. And then we have neglect, which can be incredibly painful because it's about being overlooked or dismissed. It's the parent who's glued to their phone while their child is trying to connect, or the boss who's perpetually unavailable. Even when an employee is struggling, it sends the message that your needs, your thoughts, your feelings just aren't important enough to warrant attention.
Yeah, the podcast paints a really vivid picture of this with an example of a child excitedly telling their parent, "I made pancakes for breakfast," only to be met with a distracted, without the parent even looking up from their phone.
Right.
You can almost feel that child's excitement just deflate.
It's heartbreaking because it reinforces that idea that they're not worth noticing, not worthy of attention. And that can be a heavy burden to carry, especially for a young person.
And finally, we have rejection, which is about directly refusing connection, like a parent who consistently declines to spend time with their child, even for something as simple as having pancakes together.
Right. And while it's perfectly normal to have boundaries and decline invitations sometimes, the key here is the pattern. If a child, or anyone for that matter, consistently experiences rejection from the people they care about, it can lead to feeling isolated, lonely, and unworthy.
Now, remember that bonus category I mentioned earlier?
Yeah.
Degradation. The podcast host throws this one in later in the episode and gives a really powerful example, just saying something like, "You'll never amount to anything."
Ouch.
That's a direct attack on someone's value and potential. And it can be incredibly damaging. It's not just about criticizing a choice. It's about diminishing the person as a whole.
Yeah. And what's important to remember is that these tiny traumas, they aren't limited to childhood. They can happen in any relationship. Partners, friends, colleagues, even strangers.
Yeah, that's a really good point. We tend to think of childhood as this like uniquely vulnerable time, and it is. But these dynamics can play out throughout our lives. Think about those times when, a coworker dismisses your ideas in a meeting, or a friend consistently cancels plans. those seemingly small actions, they can still sting, especially if they become a pattern.
Right, and this is where that awareness piece comes in. Now that you're starting to recognize these tiny traumas, you might be thinking, okay, great, now I'm going to be analyzing every interaction, walking on eggshells.
Right.
But that's not the goal here. It's not about becoming hypersensitive. It's about understanding the impact of our words and actions. So we can choose to interact in a way that fosters connection rather than causing pain.
So how do we do that? How do we break this cycle of hurt that the podcast talks about?
Well, the key, as they highlight, is empathy. It's about putting ourselves in the other person's shoes and trying to understand their perspective. It might be tough, especially if you're dealing with someone whose behavior is frustrating or hurtful, but that's where the real growth happens.
It's easy to get caught up in our own reactions and judgments. But taking a step back and saying, okay, what might be going on for this person that's causing them to act this way? That can be really powerful.
Exactly. The podcast uses that phrase, hurt people, hurt people. And it's so true. The person who's constantly criticizing, they might be struggling with some really deep-seated insecurities. The friend who keeps canceling plans might be overwhelmed with anxiety. Recognizing that everyone is fighting a battle we know nothing about can help us approach them with a little more compassion and understanding.
So it's instead of reacting defensively or judgmentally, we can choose curiosity. And the podcast really emphasizes validation as a key part of healing from these tiny traumas.
And it makes sense when you think about it. Validation sends a message that you matter. You have value. You're worthy of love and belonging. That can be incredibly powerful for someone who's been repeatedly subjected to shame, judgment, neglect, or rejection. It's like offering them a lifeline, a reminder that they're not alone, that their feelings are valid, and that they deserve to be treated with kindness and respect.
But it's important to remember that validation doesn't mean you have to agree with someone. It's about honoring their emotional experience.
Right. It's not about condoning their behavior or saying that they're right. It's about acknowledging how they feel. So if a friend is upset because their boss yelled at them, you can validate their feelings by saying something like, wow, that must have been really humiliating and frustrating. You're not saying the boss was right to yell. You're just recognizing your friend's experience.
And that can make a huge difference, can it?
Oh, absolutely.
It can help them feel seen, heard, and understood, which can be incredibly healing, especially for someone who's been carrying the weight of those tiny traumas for years.
Absolutely. And remember, validation isn't just for other people, it's for you too. Notice how you talk to yourself, how you treat yourself. When you make a mistake or face a challenge, do you offer yourself the same kindness and compassion that you would offer a friend?
That's such an important point. We often talk about self-care, but self-validation is a huge part of that. It's about recognizing that our feelings are valid, even the messy ones.
Yeah.
And treating ourselves with gentleness and understanding.
Yeah, it's like we're rewiring our brains for kindness, both for ourselves and for the people around us.
It's not about making these sweeping changes overnight, right?
Exactly.
It's about those small, everyday moments.
Right.
The way you listen when a friend is talking.
Yeah.
Instead of getting distracted by your phone or offering genuine encouragement, instead of a backhanded compliment,
Yeah.
it's about making that conscious choice to connect, to understand, to offer support. And you never know what kind of impact that might have.
That's so true. And the podcast talks about this idea of a ripple effect, where even the smallest act of kindness can spread outwards and touch countless lives. We might not be able to erase the pain of the past, but we can create a more loving and supportive present.
I love that image, a ripple effect of kindness. It's a powerful reminder that our actions have consequences, both positive and negative. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of tiny traumas, what stands out to you the most? What's really resonating with you on a personal level?
For me, it's realizing how interconnected we all are. The hurts we inflict on others, even unintentionally, can ripple outward and create a lot of pain. But the kindness we offer can do the same. It can spread outwards, creating a more compassionate and connected world.
And that's such a hopeful thought, isn't it? That we all have the power to make a difference, even in the smallest of ways. So for everyone listening, here's a challenge for you as you go about your day. How can you incorporate validation into your interactions? Not just with loved ones, but with everyone you encounter. Can you make it a habit, a way of being in the world that spreads a little more kindness and understanding?
It's a beautiful aspiration. And I think the world could use a little more of that right now.
I couldn't agree more. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. We'll see you next time.
Okay, so what do you think about big T trauma versus little t or tiny trauma? Can you see how we're hurting each other every day unintentionally and even when we mean well? I know the AI emphasized empathy, but we must remember that it's hard to do something that you haven't first learned or experienced. Simply telling someone to do something rarely changes that behavior. It's like telling someone to stop smoking. How often does that work? It's hard to put yourself in someone else's shoes and see the world from their perspective when you've never really felt like anyone has done that for you. This is how the negative feedback loop continues and the emotional pain perpetuates. We cannot simply demand a certain behavior authoritatively. We must emulate it for others first. The onus is on the parent, teacher, boss, or person with the greater or equal responsibility or authority. And this is why acknowledgement and validation work so well, because that is something you can start practicing and getting into the habit of doing today. You'll be amazed how positive the interactions become and how quickly it takes effect. What do you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts and hope you'll join a deeper conversation by joining this episode's Uchi Tribe. Click the link in the show notes and let's take a step toward real change together. Thanks for joining me on this episode of Question It. Remember, growth happens outside your comfort zone, so keep experimenting with life and embracing change. If you enjoyed this episode, please connect with me in the show notes, leave a 5-star review on the platform of your choice, and please join this episode's Uchi Tribe to dig into deeper conversation with me and fellow listeners. Until next time, peace, love, and connect.